I'm Elle, Osili-Wood, your host, and today we are talking storytelling. I'm really excited about this one. I know a lot of you are really interested in narrative design. So, we've lined up some pretty incredible speakers for you. I'm not going to do a longer introduction than that. They are so great that I just want to kick things off. So I'm going to get each of our fantastic guests to introduce themselves, starting off with Kim.
Hi there, my name is Kim MacAskill and I was senior writer for upcoming games Suicide Squad, Fable, and currently principal narrative designer for NaturalMotion, and it is a pleasure to be here.
I'm Dave. I am a cinematics director for TT Games, who's part of Warner Brothers, and I'm currently working on LEGO Star Wars: The Skywalker Saga.
Hi, my name's Andy Hall. I'm currently principal writer at Creative Assembly, working on the Total War series for Warhammer and many history games. Yeah, great to be here.
I'm going to start things off by chatting about how you all got into games, how you started out on this career path. So, Andy, I'll throw straight back to you.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm not a traditional entry into the industry. So I actually started off as a mail order troll in Nottingham at a place called Games Workshop, which is obviously where the Warhammer IP comes from. And from there, I managed to gravitate towards the Games Workshop studio and worked on many tabletop games. And then I switched across to the licensing department, where we would take our tabletop games and license them out to the likes of EA and Sega, of course, THQ. And there I got to know many people in the industry, and also worked on White Dwarf magazine. And from there, I kind of slipped across the digital divide into video games as a freelance writer for a good few years. And then I got headhunted by Creative Assembly, and this is what led me here.
I see what you're saying. Maybe it's not the most straightforward for everybody to replicate, but really interesting nonetheless. Dave, how about you? How did you get into games?
Well, I first started as an animator. I was a 2D drawn animator and a model animator. Actually, I did all sorts of bits of animation and worked in sort of TV series for a little while. And then eventually became an animator, again, like Andy, sort of became part of the digital world. This is a long time ago. And I'd started working as an animator for games companies, and then moved to TT about 15 years ago, where I worked on LEGO Star Wars 2. That was my first job for TT, and then became a lead animator and then a cutscene cinematics director. So yes, now I direct cameras and animation, and I also do script writing.
And Kim, how about you?
Absolute accident. Absolute accident. I actually started I was a stand-up comedian for 6 years, and then kind of fell into writing for comedy on the back of that. It was good, but it wasn't paying the bills, and I was a gamer, but I never once thought that I could ever make a career in that. But I'll be honest, I think I was sending about 20 CVs a day to anyone that would read anything that I was writing, and it just so happened that being a comic book fan and a comedy writer landed me a role with Rocksteady, which was my first game writing position. But it was sheer luck, and I do think it's also a testament to how much game story telling has changed and how much it's progressing. We do have people coming from different areas now.
I love hearing people's paths into games because they're always so strange. You think it's going to be, I did a game design degree, or it's always something completely a million miles away. So I guess, what does an average day look like for you? Because I think sometimes that's a bit of an easier way to explain, what kind of your job entails. So a day or a week, if it's perhaps, a little bit less linear than that. Dave, I'll start off with you.
It varies quite a lot, actually, depending on where we are in the production process. But when we're in the middle of producing a game, it consists of directing what we call layout artists to set up the cameras and the scenes in the game. It can be writing the scenes for the game. So we kind of we'll have a script, and we have camera direction that needs writing as well. So I can be doing that. And I can be directing animators to produce the scenes. So there's quite a lot of collaboration that goes on between these various different departments. And then right now we're getting towards the end of the production of this particular game, so there's a lot of checking and reviewing going on, and spotting really irritating little things that need fixing, hundreds and hundreds of things. So yeah, there's a broad range of things to do.
And Andy, how about you? What does an average day or week look like for you?
Well, today's pretty boring, to be honest. I've just been writing some building descriptions. Friday, however, was a more varied day. That involved several Skype interviews for looking for another writer, and there was a movie script that needed finishing off as well. So I'm quite lucky because I'm principal, so I get to put my fingers in lots of pies. I get to fly in, do some stuff, and then fly out again. So it's pretty cool, to be honest.
Kim, how does the day look for you?
Kind of similar to what Dave says. I think depending on where you are at in production, it will have a massive impact on where your priorities are going to lie. Pre-production, it's going to be a lot more high-level meetings about where do you kind of see the game going, what characters do we, what kind of game do we want to make, and that's going to take a lot of like maybe presenting, discussions. When you're fully in production, that's where things change. So some days you might not even, like for me as a writer, I might not even write at all. I might be sat with designers or artists or people from different departments, trying to make sure that the story is intact, trying to make sure that the story is being championed, trying to make sure that there's consistency and continuity within the story, and at the same time having those conversations to see if we need to change things. And then sometimes I get to write words. It really does vary. So
that kind of leads perfectly actually into my next question, because one of the things I wanted to talk about is, you know, the kind of technical constraints, or in fact just the team working constraints that come with storytelling for games. So I think in a lot of other mediums, whether it's kind of film or TV, you know, the story is the most important thing and everything else fits around it. Whereas in games, that, you know, that doesn't really feel like it's the case, because the technical side of it is so important. So how do you kind of balance that? How do you, to sound very pretentious, how do you kind of, you know, keep your truth as a storyteller when somebody comes up to you and says, okay, no, the level can't go like that, that doesn't fit?
When I came into games, one thing I thought I was only going to have to do was write a script, and that was it. And then what you learn very quickly is that this is a marriage between so many different skill sets. Do you want your story to go out as best as you can? Do you want to champion that story? Yes, absolutely. But there's got to be compromise along the way. At the end of the day, we are all serving the game, and the story is included in that. For example, you might say, hey, but we made this whole weapon where you can fight underwater, and then tech art are going to go, you're not getting an ocean. So narratively, we don't have a place for this gun. And it's like, you will have to find one that is not where you originally wanted that water gun to be. So that's kind of one side of it. And then the other side of it is when story-wise you do come in and go, actually, this is the hill we die on here. This is it. You kind of have to pick and choose your moments sometimes, and that's not because you don't care about the story, but because as a writer in games, I think you're writing, but you're also problem solving. Everyone is always problem solving, and you just hope that by the end of it, that you have done your best to create the best story you can, with the best design that you can, with the best art that you can, and that it will all merge together as best as it can. So.
Dave, obviously you kind of straddle both of those sides. You know, I always think of animation as, you know, somewhere very in between what we think of traditionally as kind of narrative and, you know, technical, you know, code heavy side of gaming. So for you, is it a little bit easier, or are you kind of always trying to keep both sides happy?
I don't know if it's compromise, but there's a lot of debate between the two sort of disciplines, really. But I find that I do quite a lot of adaptation, because I've worked on lots of different tie-ins to movies, and we have to, obviously you can't tell the entire film or set of films, like in the Skywalker saga, like Star Wars' Skywalker saga. There are 9 films that we're looking at, and we can't show everything. There is an adaptation for each film. So there are always those choices to make over which bits you want to focus on, but you have to still have the thread of the story working through. And I think the more titles I've worked on, and I've worked on a lot, the more the game carries elements of the story within it. And there's a lot of sort of spread of that story going on through the different sections. There's always a balance to be made, but we kind of inform each other. Sometimes design will look at things and go, actually, this would be much better as cinematics. And then other times we'll look at things and go, don't forget this bit needs to be in here somewhere. And they'll go, oh yeah, actually that would work better as a little bit of gameplay. So that does happen. But yeah, there's quite a lot of setting up at the start to make sure that that's all going to work.
Andy, I guess it's quite similar for you because, you know, if we're talking something that has a huge outside life of its own, Warhammer would be that thing, you know, endless history, years and years and years of players and lore and that kind of thing. So how do you balance, you know, telling a story like that and yet, you know, making it work as a game, particularly when you're also working with an existing franchise there?
There's several plates to spin. But I suppose we came at it and that we'd done 15 years of history games, and this was another history, a fictional history. And it's one of the reasons they brought me on in the first place was I was effectively the Warhammer version of a historian or archaeologist. They need building descriptions, but rather than building descriptions for a blacksmith, what kind of buildings do goblins have or dwarfs? And as well as kind of putting it in context, and I think that's what narrative does actually, no matter what the gameplay loop is, whether it's a historical strategy or a great action adventure game, be that Uncharted or Batman, for instance. I think what we do is give that context to allow the players to kind of care about what's happening to Nathan Drake, to Batman, to a champion in Warhammer.
So what does your process look like? Where do you start? Dave, I'll begin with you.
Well, we start with a game design right at the start, and then I work off the back of that. In terms of the narrative, that the game design drives that, and I'll look at the whole flow of that all the way through the game and think about where the important moments of the storytelling need to be, and I'll kind of flesh that out and divide that into different little sections that we need to focus on. If we're tied into a film, obviously we have to keep watching the film and check that all the bits are in there, that the relevant bits are in there, the important bits. And after that, once we've sort of completed that phase, it's about starting to think about the script itself. So I'll look at the screenplay if I'm working from a screenplay. If it's original, then we'll start to have a look at any reference material we might have and start to put ideas together. And then we add a camera script to that, which is not strictly to do with writing, but it's important in terms of, getting the images to work and the visual storytelling to read properly.
Andy, what does your process look like? Is it similar to that, or have you got a completely different way of doing things?
It's not like a novel. You can't sit down in front of a blank page and just write this crazy novel or story that's been in your head. And if you do, go be a novelist, because a games writing isn't quite that. It's I think, as Kim's alluded to, it's talking to many different departments and making sure you supply them with the words, with the narrative. So I suppose the process in a way is you start with a small group of the project leads effectively, and then it starts to filter down, and then people, at all levels can start, it's never a solo experience in game making, can then start, pitching their own ideas, and you can fold that into the narrative and stuff. Certainly that's my experience.
Kim, how about you?
Something I always say time and time again is that the games industry is changing so fast and quickly that when you start a new game, there's no cookie cut method to start a game. That's just not a thing. And so when you go in, it's like don't feel worried if you go into your first game and it has a blank canvas and you're like, oh, I don't understand the process, because chances are we're making it up as we go. I mean, for me, in the past couple of games that I have worked in, one thing that I noticed does come up a lot is that yes, if it's an existing IP, we will research off the back of that. We will look at what do we want, what do we not want. We start to form pillars narratively. What kind of game is this tonally? What are the characters like tonally? What will they do? What won't they do? And then off the back of that, design will kind of come into play. We'll get concept arts of certain characters, and it'll kind of roll from there. And not fluidly either. There'll be back and forths and all sorts. But yeah, that's a very long way of saying just, game by game, it might just be slightly different.
You're all storytellers in different ways. why did you choose games as your medium? You know, why did you feel like this was a place where you could kind of most effectively tell your story?
Well, it looks like everybody's here accidentally, doesn't it, really? I didn't have any sort of desire to be a writer at all. When I was at college or uni, I was making short films as part of a fine art degree. So I was starting to look at narrative then. But there wasn't any dialogue in it, and then there wasn't any dialogue in our games until I think the first game we did was Lego Batman 2, and I think also there was dialogue in when we did Lego Lord of the Rings that was straight from the film, you know. So I had to start learning about writing then and making sure things work, and then as things have built, I've just started writing more and more original bits and pieces. I didn't dream 20 years ago, whenever it was, that I would be working in games, because it wasn't a thing I was going to do. But I think we've all got those similar sort of career paths in that they kind of wind around. Like you said earlier, there are, you know, lots of degrees and pathways for people in specifically to go into this area now. So it's all quite different. But I think you just don't shut off anything from where you think you might want to go.
Just off the back of what Dave said, you know, yeah, people coming in from different angles and I think again is a mirror to how much games has changed, especially for storytelling. We're not writing Sonic the Hedgehog anymore. We're writing BAFTA award-winning stories now, like God of War and things. There's so many. The requirements are different. I mean, for me, coming from stand-up, and I should say, once I left stand-up, I went into television. And when I came into games, I still remember thinking, I can do Batman characters. This is fine. I can, you know, write storylines like that. And I just had no idea what it was going to be like to sit in a room full of designers who were essentially speaking a language I did not understand. I thought I get it, and then I just heard all this terminology I hadn't heard before. So I'll be honest, I think in the first couple of months I nearly left. I was very, very close to leaving. I was given a book about narrative design to try and learn it. And I devoured this book over Christmas and came back and thought, this is it. I understand game design now. I can write a game. And then walked in and then realized that different studios use different words in different ways. And at that point, I just threw that book in the bin and was like, I'm just going to have to be very very humbled and just ask questions all of the time. And it took me about 6 months, I'll be honest, before I really was able to go, I think I kind of maybe slightly know what I'm doing. So it wasn't a case of why games, it was what kept me in games. And as a storyteller, the one thing I couldn't do in television was go, can I have a monster and a spaceship and a helicopter chase and a tank that shoots 5 different guns? Things that, you know, if you went to a TV producer, they would go, oh no, because that's money. Whereas in games, you can create worlds and your imagination as a writer can go tonto. It can go nuts, and animators can make this happen. And when you see that happening for the first time and you go, that was my character, that was my planet I made. There's something, as a storyteller, you can't really beat it. So I'm kind of stuck here now.
Andy, I'm coming back to you. Has games ended up being the place where you feel most comfortable telling your stories, or that works best with your storytelling style? Or is it, you know, just where you ended up and now you are also stuck here?
No, to be fair, it is a thoroughly enjoyable medium to tell stories, but the challenge is it's not a solo event. I suppose the most purest form of storytelling we do in Total War are the movies, the little kind of 3-minute kind of 2D art movies, and that is a great outlet for us. It's been quite recent, from Warhammer 2 onwards. I suppose that's the purest form we get to be storytellers, and even then, that's a collaborative method, working with some great cinematic artists. What we can do there is take these little story nuggets that existed in Warhammer for years and kind of immortalize them in kind of the film, where before they've only ever existed on you know, in little little bits of colour text in White Dwarf or the many rule books. It's almost like bringing these IPs to life.
Speaking of great storytelling, I want to know what you all consider, great storytelling. For you, what's key to knowing that you have successfully communicated your story within a game? Kim, I'm immediately throwing to you for this one.
Oh, tricky one. I think there's a few things in there, but ultimately what you want to do is to get the players to care enough about your character that it matters to them what happens to that character once you make that connection. And if you can do that on an emotional level, even if that main character has to do things that are bad, that are evil, but the player is still rooting for them and wants to, I think once you get them on that level, I think that's when you know that you're telling your story well and you're taking them on that journey, because ultimately that player character that you have is that vessel for some sort of emotional experience that you want them to explore, and it's all about connecting them to that. So if by the end of that story I feel like they have emotionally connected for the duration of it, then I think in its most basic term, I think I've done good enough.
So Dave, how about you? What for you is great storytelling?
That's a really difficult question, isn't it? What's fantastic now that we didn't have in the good old days, whenever that was, is the instant feedback on stuff. When you get stuff on YouTube, or you have comments on, because people tend to post our movies online, and you get a lot of fans commenting how great things are. I mean, that is fantastic. Getting instant feedback is fabulous. I mean, obviously you get the odd negative comment, but by and large they're all really good, and they're all really, people find things funny, and having a link to something that you have written, that's a spin on something that's happened in a film, and the fans like it, is fabulous. There's another great thing about working in games, is that you have a totally international audience, generally speaking, and that there are people sitting in a trailer in America somewhere, or they could be in Japan, or they could be in anywhere, playing your work and enjoying it and sharing a game with parents and children. That's fantastic to know that you're doing that, and that's providing people with fun.
I agree with Dave. I think we live in an era where we can actually literally see the audience reaction, and we've had that with many reaction videos to our trailers, and it is great knowing that when you've written a trailer or helped contribute to a trailer, and there's a sting in the tail. And yeah, I'll admit, I will go on YouTube and have a look, and when that reveal is there, seeing draws drop, it does fulfill you as a storyteller.
So what's kind of your recommendation for practical things people can go out and do if they're looking to get into this industry? Because obviously, as we discussed, there's lots of ways in, but what should they be practicing? What should they be working on at home? What should they be looking out for in the games that they play?
If you want to write, I think that's been, somebody famous has said that at some point. I think if you write, you're a writer, and I'm not. I don't spend time at home writing. I spend most of my time trying to tell the stories visually, and it's an aspect of what I do. But in terms of getting into being a writer and working in games, I would say focusing on the sorts of games that you want to make and the sorts of stories you want to tell. I don't think you can play or watch or read too much. And I would also recommend looking at other things that aren't to do with the discipline that you want to follow. I started getting into reading screenplays for films, and I actually really enjoy reading screenplays as pieces of writing. There are lots of different ways of writing screenplays, and there are, as a cinematic way of creating a story, there's nothing better. So it just depends on what sorts of games you want to write for and you want to be working in, really.
Andy, how about you? If somebody wanted to do what you do, what would you recommend that they work on at home?
Well, we've just literally hired a brand new young talent who is currently a pension clerk in Durham. So the opportunities are there. The good news is that you guys, this next generation coming up, there's going to be even more kind of opportunities than there was in my generation, and certainly in the previous generation before that, where games writing wasn't even a thing. It was just something one of the programmers would do. There's certainly ways you can kind of help yourself in that respect. If the company sends you a test, do the test. Pretty obvious, but you'll be surprised how many people inquired about this recent vacancy, and then when they saw there was a test to do, they didn't do it. So immediately do the test, do it well, make sure there's no spelling errors or punctuation. I'm not going to get too technical, don't worry. But yeah, certainly show willing. Young artists, ArtStation. We're always looking on ArtStation for young talented artists. And yeah, as Dave said, don't just stick to the games writing. If you can write in games, you can write in movies, you can write screenplays. Look up Video Game Storytelling, it's called, by Evan Skolnick. That's a great thing. It talks about narrative in general, as well as how to use narrative in video games. I'd recommend that book.
Kim, how about you? What are your, practical tips to anybody who wants to do what you do?
I will start with writing, because obviously that's where I came from. I mean, what I would say is that for me personally, it took me about, I'd say 8 to 10 years to really make a living off of writing, and hopefully it will take way less time for you guys than it did for me. One thing that I will say is trust your own voice. As Dave said, look at the games that you enjoy, that kind of style of writing that you have, because here's the thing, you are not going to please every single studio because of the variety of games there. Any game that was, say, based in a war somewhere is probably not going to suit me. I'm a comedy writer, any test that I did, it's probably not going to be their bag. And even like in applying for other jobs, I've been told, she tries to be too funny when that's not really what we need for our game, for our thing. You will be applying for jobs where you don't know what the game is, so it really is a bit of a stab in the dark. But what I will say is, don't try and second guess what the studio wants. Do a piece that speaks to your voice, because somewhere along the line that will be that perfect match for that studio, and it will set you aside from the competition. So it is a bit of a gamble, but when it works so well. So just trust your voice. And if I can say, if you are going to do a writing test, try your hardest to keep it in less than 6 pages where possible, because the amount of writing tests I've had where it was a scene between 3 characters, that was our test, and I would get writing samples that were like 12, 15 pages long, which is the format equivalent of half of a sitcom pilot. And when I'm asking for a scene to get me to an objective, try and get it as punchy and as effective and as short, like the best 5 pages you can write, because if I'm not sold on page 3, chances are by page 8 I'm still not going to be sold. Try and get me by page 1. But yeah, trust your voice, be bold, try and make it as short and snappy as you can. And there is a great Facebook group called Game Writers on Facebook at the moment, and it is for UK game writers. There's always opportunities being posted there, advice being posted there. People from the Games Writers Guild are also on there as well if you need any advice, so do check them out as well.
Now we're going to move on to questions that we have had from our YGDers. So, how important is invisible storytelling in games? So, for example, story elements inferred by the objects and environments in the game, like the alphabet used on something or the type of building style used. Kim, I'm going to throw kind of straight back to you for that one.
Absolutely. Invisible storytelling can come through, like you said, the building that you have to the slight interaction that you have. Everything is contributing to this world. Everything is contributing to that, no matter what you're interacting with, no matter what a street name is named after. Games really gives you this opportunity to really indulge in a way that maybe you wouldn't get to do in TV or films. You get to indulge in every single microscopic thing, whether it's interactive or not. So invisible stuff is very important. And this is why when you do go in games, please keep the best relationships that you can with all artists, environment, concept, everything, because the artists are trying to tell a story as much as you are.
Andy, I feel like Warhammer, and actually just Total War in general, is kind of the perfect place for invisible storytelling and kind of subtext and context clues. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so-called invisible storytelling, it's pretty unique to our medium in that respect, that you can really do deep dives on this stuff. I mean, when I play other games, I'm one for collecting every audio tape there is, or every kind of lore fragment. When I was working at Games Workshop, we had something called Door Ajar narrative, and that kind of meant that you're leaving the door slightly ajar at something. So you would probably make a casual reference to the rubric of Karnos, for instance. I don't know what that is, but the fact that it's there and hinted at, what is the potential is there, and that lets the player start to fill in those blanks. Or alternatively, we may come back in 2 years' time and actually explain what the rubric of Karnos is. So it is a great technique, especially for our medium.
I'm going to put two questions together here, because basically Dylan Hart asked, how much insight into characters and games do you get when you're kind of writing scenes that have characters in them? And then Lewis Jackson said, how do you write main characters interestingly without making them a blank slate? So I feel like those can kind of come together as a question about, you know, building characters and where you start with a new character in a game. So Andy, I'll throw that one to you.
It's interesting in my context in that you play as one of these kind of Warhammer superheroes, these Warhammer villain or hero, whether it's Teclis of the High Elves or the dwarf Thorgrim Grudgebearer. So you already kind of exists, but you do want to give the player some room for them to grow themselves. I can imagine it's the same whether you're playing Batman or even Indiana Jones. So what we do is we take like famous lines that they've said, famous references, but we want to keep the player to make sure they have ownership. And I think a lot of the time that's what stuff like skill trees are about. So you can like build up Batman, and you can make him a more of a stealthy Batman or more of a combat Batman. Even though he's still Batman, there's a little bit of your investment there. The other opposite end of the spectrum is something like Fortnite, where the player pretty much builds an avatar from the ground up. So I think we're further along that scale, where we're taking some well-known IP characters, but we still give a little bit for the player to invest and have ownership of.
Yeah, I mean, because they're so often based on IPs. Often there aren't really original characters to write for. But it's a matter of working with that IP, and sometimes with the people who are actually working on the IP, like we were with Lego Star Wars Skywalker Saga, because obviously the films are being made as you're making the project. So there's a bit of discussion in there as to as to how to take it, which is fun to work with.
Kim, is there anything that you kind of want to add on how you build characters?
And the one example I will give is on Arkham Knight, where everyone was like, when are we getting the Batmobile? When is the Batmobile? When is the Batmobile? We gave them the Batmobile. Batmobile's rubbish. We hate it. You know what I mean? One thing I will take is, with an existing IP, you cannot make everybody happy. That is going to be a thing. And it's the same with characters, but as a writer, it's the thing that I really enjoy. Like, for example, you could have a villain, and I do always look to comic books for this, where someone has always been 2D evil. Then you get a chance to have a crack at it, and then you go, how 2D evil are they? You know what I mean? How, you know, maybe there's another thing to them. Maybe they were just really misunderstood. You know, there's so many moving parts within characters. So when it comes to your version of it, and when I say your version of it, I don't mean like me myself. It's kind of going, okay, is this the same type of character dynamics that we want to portray? What are we going to do that's different for this IP? What are we going to do that's different for these characters? And that's going to come through the conflicts that you give them along the way. So someone who was maybe very, very evil before suddenly has new conflicts and new things to come up against. It's maybe going to make the player feel a bit more, you know, they might relate to them a bit more.
So I had a question that I loved, which was, Amalia, I'm hoping I said your name right. How often do your game designs and ideas get rejected? Anybody want to jump in?
So much, so often. It's painful. I mean, like I said, a game can take like 5 years, sometimes more. You are not going to get every idea in. And sometimes you will think an idea has made it. It has been agreed upon. People have worked on it. A year and a half later, they're like, actually, we're changing that now.
So much that.
Yeah,
So
rejection.
much that. You're working on a 3 or 4 year old game, and you'll protect this idea. It's my darling. But it will go if the tech director says they can't do it, or even the game director.
A huge thank you to Kim, Dave and Andy for joining us. You were totally brilliant. I mean, I feel like I learned so much, let alone our brilliant young game designers. I've been Elle Osili-Wood, and this has been the BAFTA YGD Masterclass series.